If you like what you're about to hear, please consider leaving a review, or liking, sharing, and commenting and subscribing on YouTube. I don't have a Patreon or enable ads for this, so if you really like Oldex, please do contact Games Workshop on social media or via email and tell them you want me to narrate their audiobooks for realsies. Oldex, Codex Chaos Space Marines, 4th edition, pages 50 and 51. Ahriman, Exile of the Thousand Suns, written by Thorpe and Alessio Cavatore, narrated by R.J. Bailey, with great thanks to Alistair for donating this copy of Codex Chaos Space Marines. Ahriman, Exile of the Thousand Suns. Towards the end of the Great Crusade, Magnus the Red compiled a truly monumental tome of sorcery called the Book of Magnus. Sometimes known as the Book of the Thousand Suns, this grimoire is filled with arcane lore from across the galaxy. As chief librarian, Ahriman was keeper of the book on the Thousand Suns homeworld of Prospero. Like his Primarch, Ahriman had become obsessed with arcane mysteries as he fought through the galaxy on the Great Crusade. He had encountered isolated cultures where magic had re-emerged as the dominant form of power after the machines had failed. Ahriman studied Magnus's grimoire and explored its inner secrets extensively. His power gradually grew as he grasped the subtle nuances of magic discovered by wise men across the millennia. Like all of the Thousand Suns, Ahriman believed that the power of the warp could be harnessed for the good of mankind. Only weakness of the mind and spirit prevented ordinary men from utterly controlling this untapped energy. Over time, the most powerful and influential of the Legion's brethren began to think of themselves as sorcerers, and they devoted more and more time to uncovering the mystical secrets of the universe, rather than fighting the Emperor's continual wars. Knowing that no man, be he the lowest beggar or a mighty Primarch, could truly withstand the temptations of chaos once they began to dabble in its power, the Emperor unleashed the Space Wolves against Prospero. Delicate towers of vast antiquity were smashed to rubble by energy beams from above. Vast libraries of incalculably precious works were burned beneath a rain of fusion fire. Stunned by the magnitude of this unexpected attack, the Thousand Suns saved what they could and fled. They summoned sorceress wards to protect themselves, and then broke the Space Wolves' blockade in their surviving ships to seek sanctuary with Horus. Thus, the fate of the Thousand Suns was sealed. Knowledge is power, and with the key to the Black Library, I shall claim it. Ahriman of the Thousand Suns. Only after Horus's defeat did the other aspects of Tzeentch's patronage begin to impinge on the Thousand Suns. The first visible signs were the grotesque mutations that manifested themselves among the battle brethren. With Magnus remaining silent on the matter, Ahriman was foremost amongst the sorcerers to decry this turn of events, and their horror turned to fear when some of their own number began to warp and change. They had failed to master the power of chaos. Instead, chaos was mastering them. Ahriman vowed that the long path to knowledge they had trodden would not end in madness and abomination. In the shadowy halls of the Thousand Suns' new city, Ahriman began to study the Book of Magnus with a desperate fervor, seeking some way to prevent the Legion devolving any further. In time, he prepared the Rubric of Ahriman, a spell so potent it would unleash forces far beyond his control. He formed a secret conclave of the most powerful sorcerers that had resisted the insidious spread of mutation, though he knew that even together Their powers might not be enough to direct the rubric of Ahriman as intended. To Ahriman, it was worth the risk. If it worked, the great spell would free the Thousand Sons from the taint of mutation for all eternity. The cabal of sorcerers at first refused to aid Ahriman, so dangerous was his plan. Yet when Magnus was elevated to the ranks of the demon princes, it became clear that the last vestiges of humanity were being driven from the Legion. At last, the sorcerers agreed to join their power together, and a terrible cataclysm of magic surrounded the planet of the sorcerers. It is said that even the demons fled before the roaring maelstrom of magic Ahriman and the others unleashed upon their world. Crackling clouds of multicolored energy descended from the skies and enveloped the great silver towers of the Thousand Suns. Forking bolts of blue and yellow lightning struck down the corrupted space marines, one after the other. No sorcerous ward or physical defense could keep the wild powers at bay. The storm of magic raged for an eternal night, which could have been days or centuries, until finally Magnus himself used his unearthly powers to end it. It became clear that the rubric of Ahriman had surpassed the sorcerer's expectations and failed horribly. All battle brethren of little or non-existent sorcerous power had been reduced to piles of dust within their sealed armor suits, though their souls lived on, after a fashion, within their armor. Though these warriors had been as good as wiped out, Ahriman declared that he was satisfied with the outcome. The physical corruption of the Thousand Sons had been halted at the cost of a terrible price. Though Magnus knew that all plots and schemes are but twists in the convoluted plans of Tzeentch, he also knew that the conspirators who had done this terrible thing to his legion could not go unpunished. The demon Primarch banished Ahriman and his cabal from the planet of the sorcerers for all eternity. He doomed them to wander the Eye of Terror and beyond, in a perpetual search for perfect understanding. Over the millennia, Ahriman has sought out magical artifacts, ancient arcane books, talented psychers, and any aspect of sorcerous knowledge or power. Though his own collection of talismans, amulets, and grimoires rivals that of Magnus, Ahriman is driven by the constant hunger for more knowledge. To acquire such things, Ahriman has attacked museums and the private collections of antiquarians, much to the mystification of his victims. In many circumstances, magical artifacts are acquired by local chaos cults, and Ahriman merely comes to take them away, together with any talented cultists who might make promising adepts. It often comes as an unpleasant surprise to a cult magus to find that his efforts to summon help from the Thousand Sons merely result in losing his cult's treasured possessions and the most gifted of his coven. Over recent years, Ahriman has turned all of his energy to locating the fabled Black Library of the Eldar Harlequins, seeking to plunder its legendary tomes of gathered chaos lore. The Athenaeum of Callimachus. During the Great Crusade, scribes known as Remembrancers accompanied the Space Marine legions. It was their duty to record the deeds of the Space Marines. One of the Remembrancers of the Thousand Sons was Callimachus, who followed Magnus and his warriors over a dozen war zones. When the heresy came, Callimachus realized his records were a collection of mystic rites. He feared for his safety and fled Prospero with his works. After the Space Wolves destroyed that world, none spared a thought for the missing Remembrancer. It was only after his casting of the rubric and exile by Magnus that Ahriman recalled the writings of Callimachus. For 1,600 years Ahriman sought the books of the Remembrancer. He eventually found them on the world of Apollonia. In the millennium and a half since Callimachus's flight, a priesthood had grown up around the books, guarded by a fanatical sect of warriors. A citadel housed the library of works called the Athenaeum of Callimachus. Beneath the citadel, in a vault lined with protective rooms, the books sat amidst smouldering sorcerous flames. When Ahriman led his 1,000 sons to claim the books, the wardens of the Athenaeum fought with zealous determination, if little skill. Aided by his fearless and deadly warriors, Ahriman eventually triumphed after a bitter, month-long siege. The sorcerer plundered the writings of Callimachus before burning the library to ashes, so that only he would hold the secrets it had contained. You have been listening to Oldex, Codex Chaos Space Marines, 4th edition, pages 50 and 51, Ahriman, Exile of the Thousand Suns, written by Gav Thorpe and Alessio Cavatore, narrated by R.J. Bailey. With great thanks to Alistair for donating this copy of Codex Chaos Space Marines. Thank you to Gav Thorpe and Alessio Cavatore for writing the fiction I grew up with. If you've enjoyed this, please leave a review where you found it, or like, share, and subscribe on YouTube, depending how you're listening. I don't have a Patreon or enable ads for this, so if you really like Oldex, please do contact Games Workshop on social media or via email, and tell them you want me to narrate their audiobooks for realsies. This production, like all of Oldex, is entirely unofficial and uncommercial. From an out-of-print publication, is a derivative work with all copyrights owned by Games Workshop, and is a celebration of the hobby and lore I grew up with. If you have suggestions for other old Codex fiction for me to narrate on this podcast, you can comment, contact me on Twitter at rjbailey, or email robertjbailey@gmail.com. Links are in the show description.